Hello, everybody. I am John Clay, sports columnist with the Lexington Herald-Leader and Kentucky.com. I'm here along with my colleagues, Ben Roberts and Cam Drummond of the Herald-Leader and Kentucky.com. First of all, how are you guys doing?
Doing good,
Good.
John. Thanks so much for having us, and excited to talk about the Derby with you guys.
Yeah, we're gearing up for the Kentucky Derby. That's what we're going to talk about today. Kentucky Derby 149, Saturday, May the 6th. It's a 6:57 post time at Churchill Downs. NBC will have the television coverage, but we'll have plenty of coverage on Kentucky.com and the print edition of the Herald-Leader leading up to the race next week, during the race and after the race. Before we get into the particulars of this year's Derby, we're going to talk about the field overall. We're going to talk about the favorites. We're also going to talk about maybe some possible long shots going into the Derby, especially in the Derby week next week. Unfortunately, we have to address the story of the day, and that was Wild on Ice, Kentucky Derby contender, winner of the Sunland Park Derby, the Grade 3 Sunland Park Derby, during a workout this morning at Churchill Downs. Unfortunately, Wild on Ice suffered a left hind leg injury. He was vanned to Lexington and unfortunately had to be euthanized in Lexington. Really puts a damper on this week before Derby week. Wild on Ice, kind of an interesting story. Vanned up to Churchill Downs from New Mexico, from Sunland Park down there, much like mine. That bird did when before he won the Derby. Also had a 60-year-old jockey, Wild on Ice did, and who would have been the oldest jockey to ride in the Kentucky Derby had he been able to ride. Just very unfortunate. And unfortunately, we've seen a rash of these types of things that have happened in the last week or so. I know there have been some problems out at Keeneland, Cam. What do you know about that?
Yeah, as you mentioned, unfortunate that we have to kind of start with the news of the day and kind of puts a damper on the preparations leading up to the Kentucky Derby. Obviously, this will be a storyline kind of going into the race as well. A horse will draw into the field, and we'll still have, what's expected to be a full 20-horse field for the Derby, but you never want to see something like this. And one of the unfortunate realities that happens too often in horse racing with what happened with Wild on Ice earlier today. But yeah, you mentioned what's happened at Keeneland. There's been 3 horse deaths so far as part of racing incidents so far during the Keeneland spring meet, which has only been going for a couple days. They only race for a certain amount of days here in April. Already 3 deaths, most deaths since 2019 at the track. And again, we're still not even complete with the spring meet. They run today. They run again tomorrow, Friday, April 28th. To close things out, not a great scene at Keeneland. It's been some racing incidents, moments where jockeys have pulled horses up pretty soon after they've left the starting gate, or they've felt some kind of weakness or limpness in one of their legs following the conclusion of a race where they get checked out by the equine safety teams. And unfortunately, the determination has to be made whether or not they're able to survive or recover from their injuries. But yeah, as you mentioned, it's been difficult at Keeneland so far, the spring meet, with 3 deaths, most since 2019, and something that obviously everyone involved with is going to try and rectify before the fall meet comes up in October.
Yeah, and I think there will be a lot of talk about HISA. HISA was supposed to put in their new drug medication rules. Really, I think for a second time they tried to do that. It was supposed to be in effect for the Derby, but they pushed those back now to May 22nd. So we'll see how that plays out as well. I should mention that now Skinner is in the field of 20 as of today. Skinner finished 3rd in the Santa Anita Derby, which was an excellent race. I thought Skinner ran pretty well in that race. So he's now in the field of 20. Ben, what about the field overall? What if with this year's field? How do you feel? Is this a really good field, so-so field, or does it not measure up to some of the fields we've seen recently in the Kentucky Derby?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's the greatest field that we've seen, certainly in the past several years. Obviously, I think the determination on that sometimes comes a little later in the year when we see how some of these horses fare throughout Triple Crown season and then the summer 3-year-old season. And then obviously once they start racing against older horses in the fall. Going into it, to me, watching the races on paper, not the strongest field, but I think one of the more interesting fields, especially from a handicapping and a wagering perspective. You've got, first of all, you've got a pretty clear favorite, I think, a pretty deserving favorite in Forte, but he's a horse that people don't seem to like, despite the fact that, he's won 5 races in a row, 2-year-old champion, won the Florida Derby, a lot of accolades already, but, doesn't seem to be kind of that clear cut pick for a lot of people, even though he is, I think, a clear-cut favorite. And then below him, you have a top tier of horses, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in a little bit, that have, you've got a lot of horses coming in on winning streaks. It's not just that they won that last 100-point race. They've won 2 or 3, or in some cases more races in a row coming into this field, and they've done it in most regards pretty impressively. So, not doesn't appear to be the fastest field, doesn't appear to be the field with the most long-term upside, but I think several quality horses at the top of the list.
Okay, let's talk about those favorites, and let's start with Forte. As you mentioned, I mean, he trained by Todd Pletcher, who's won the Kentucky Derby twice with Super Saver and Always Dreaming. I think Todd's had over 60 horses in the Kentucky Derby over the years. He's a multiple Eclipse Award winner for Trainer of the Year, Hall of Fame type trainer. Forte to me kind of reminds me of the NFL draft, which is going to happen tonight. You get a favorite in the race, and then like a Forte or somebody like Bryce Young tonight, and it seems like people spend all their time pointing out their flaws and how he's not going to live up to it. But Forte, to me, he's done everything he's been asked to do. He won the Claiborne Breeders' Futurity at Keeneland last year. He won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile at Keeneland last year. Then he, after a layoff, he came back, ran a strong race to win the Fountain of Youth, then ran a very unusual race where he had to come from behind and rally to win the Florida Derby. To me, he's done everything anybody would ask him to do, but his buyer numbers have gone down. It seems like he's regressed in races. Either of you have any more thoughts on Forte going into Derby week?
Yeah. And that's what kind of gets me with Forte is the Fountain of Youth. I thought was obviously his 2-year-old season was super impressive, and then the Fountain of Youth was very, very impressive. And then he comes back in the Florida Derby, and I've watched that race several times now, and even on the replay, you're just kind of waiting for him to go, and then Mage runs past him at one point going into the stretch, and he still doesn't go. And mid-stretch, you're still just kind of waiting for it. And then when he does, it's really impressive the way he just kind of zoomed by and swallowed everybody up. But visually, and then obviously looking at the numbers, the different speed figures, Thorograph, that kind of stuff, it does kind of denote a step back. And this time of year, going into this specific race, I'm always looking for who's that horse that looks like it's going to take a step forward, that this horse is on the upward trajectory. And that doesn't mean that Forte is not the best horse in the field. He's definitely should be the favorite. But I think when it gets to next Saturday, I'm probably going to be looking elsewhere, at least for my win bets and who's going to be on top of those exotics. I think he is a beatable favorite. Like you said, I mean, he's won 5 in a row. He's won big races, Grade 1 races. But I certainly think he's beatable.
Cam, you saw him race at Keeneland last year. What did you think of him?
Yeah, I was going to say, just jumping off what Ben said there, I think it's kind of more indicative of this being a downfield and not being the greatest crop of 3-year-old thoroughbreds that Forte is such a predominant favorite in this race. I mean, obviously, like Ben touched on, the winning is something that's going to get people's attention. That's going to make him a deserving favorite for the race. You look at, he's won, 5 straight graded stakes, for them being Grade 1 stakes. Obviously that kind of pedigree is going to get you the Kentucky Derby qualifying points that put you 30 points ahead of Practical Move, who's second on the qualifying leaderboard. That being said, I do think it's a down year for this Derby class. You guys mentioned the buyer figures going down. I mean, it is one thing that he's won races in a different variety of styles, not to mention at a variety of different tracks. I mean, those 5 graded stakes that he's won recently have come at Gulfstream, Keeneland, and Saratoga. So he's been able to ship different places, acclimate well to different tracks and perform when it comes to race day. But to Ben's point, this does seem like a beatable favorite, not to mention the fact that whatever the morning line odds are set, whether they be 2-1, 3-1, 4-1, that price probably does seem significantly overvalued for Forte. And like Ben, I'll probably be looking elsewhere for my value plays in terms of a win play show or an outright win as well. Not to mention the fact that this Derby field as a whole this year had a pretty high bar to get into it. You look at Skinner, which just drew into the field today after the unfortunate incident with Wild on Ice. He had 45 Derby qualifying points. Normally, that was a pretty shut and dry case to be a member of the Kentucky Derby and make the starting gate in the 20-horse field. And this year, it was a lot more difficult than that. You still have some horses that right now would be also eligible as on the outside, someone like a Cyclone Mischief or a Major Dude or even a Mandarin Hero that ran so well at Santa Anita, sitting there on 45, 40 points that wouldn't make the starting gate if the race started right now.
Yeah. Very, very good point. And you two guys, I know that's what you love to do is beat the favorite. Ben, okay, another horse that I think will be up there, Angel of Empire, won the Arkansas Derby, trained by Brad Cox, who's had just a ton of success, especially over the last 3 or 4 years. Ben, what do you think of Angel of Empire?
I really like Angel of Empire, and he'll be one of the 2 or 3 that I look at a lot more closely over the next week or so, as I'm trying to figure out those win bets and the top of the exotics. You know, he's a horse. If you look at his trajectory, he's in that Brad Cox barn. Brad Cox, as we know now, is kind of up in that Pletcher, and then when he gets back, I assume Baffert territory of having a whole lot of talented 2-year-olds that turn into talented 3-year-olds. But if you look back at his 2-year-old season, he's racing at Kentucky Downs, he's racing at Indianapolis Horseshoe. Where they had him racing early in his 2-year-old season didn't seem like they thought he was going to be one of these most talked about horses going into Kentucky Derby Day. And if you go back and watch those races, and then you look at him now, I mean, you can tell just physically how much he's progressed, how much he's matured. And I think somewhere around there, obviously a corner was turned, and Brad Cox kind of saw him as, hey, maybe this is one of my top choices. And then, the Risen Star, he beat Two Phils, who comes in with the highest buyer figure. If you're a fan of those coming into Derby Day, he beat him down there. And then I thought the Arkansas Derby, his run there, it was just dominant. It was exactly what you want to see out of a horse going into Kentucky Derby Day. And he seems to be, again, going back to the looking for horses who are on that upward trajectory, that are improving, that everybody is, all these trainers are pointing toward that first Saturday in May when you have a horse that you think can be a Kentucky Derby contender. But not all horses train the same way. Not all horses follow the same path and follow that same trajectory. This is one I feel like has at least one more, forward step in him at the right time. And that's why he's, I think, going to be at or near the top of my list next Saturday.
And traditionally, the Arkansas Derby winners have done well in the Kentucky Derby, so that obviously should help as well. Okay, let's move on to the next horse I want to talk about, and that is the Bluegrass Stakes winner, Tapit Trice. Another Todd Pletcher horse. Looks like Todd's going to have 4 horses in the race on Derby Day. Brad Cox also looks like he may have 4 horses in there as well. Cam, you were there on Bluegrass Day. What do you think of Tapit Trice?
Well, real quick, I just wanted to say, before we get too far away from the Angel of Empire discussion, you mentioned that Brad Cox is going to have, at least right now, projected 4 horses in that Derby field like Pletcher. Let's also not discount how badly Brad Cox wants to win a proper Kentucky Derby. Of course, he had the 21 winner in Mandaloun, which came, 6-7 months, after the fact, didn't get to do the proper race day celebration. Obviously, as a Louisville native, home track, nothing matters more to Brad Cox than winning a Kentucky Derby in the proper fashion. So I think that's, maybe not something that you could find from a quantitative standpoint with the Angel of Empire, especially being the 3rd choice on the Derby leaderboard, but at least qualitatively, I think that's an important storyline to look at when you look at that horse and really all of Cox's horses in the field. But yeah, Tapit Trice, honestly was very impressive in that Toyota Bluegrass Stakes. I mean, I did not think he was going to win that race. He wasn't my pick to win the race. That's probably why I never win one of those little silver julep cups they give out at Keeneland to the media member who correctly predicts the race. I think I went with Mendelssohn's March, just like Ben. So we both lost at the same time, which was reassuring. But, Tapit Trice won that duel down the stretch in the Bluegrass Stakes that came off a Tampa Bay Derby that he also won. 4 straight wins, only 2 of them coming of the graded stakes variety, with the Bluegrass Stakes being the far and away best field he competed against, and probably his best performance, winning a showdown down the stretch like that and coming out, I think, by a neck was the margin he won. And Todd Pletcher, as you mentioned earlier, has a couple Derby winners to his name, knows how to get horses ready for the Derby. No one's more familiar with Churchill Downs or the preparation that goes to getting a horse to peak at this time of year. That being said, I'm not completely sold on Tapit Trice. I mentioned that Bluegrass Stakes was probably the best field he competed against. And even then, I thought that was a pretty weak field for the Bluegrass Stakes, kind of, again, representative of this being a down year in terms of the 20 horses that will make the starting gate. So not completely there on Tapit Trice. That being said, Luis Saez is a good jockey. Todd Fletcher has been there and done that before. So definitely will be a popular name that comes up around both casual horse racing fans and some of the experienced handicappers as well come next Saturday.
All excellent points. I'm kind of like you on Tapatrice. I thought he ran a really good race in the Bluegrass, but I'm not completely sold on him.
You picked him to win that Bluegrass, though. You were in on that before any of us.
I did pick him to win. I thought he was the best horse in that field, although there was another horse in that field I like too, and we'll talk about him later on when we get to the long shot portion of this. Okay, Ben, let's move on to the next horse. Somebody who has not been there and done that in the Kentucky Derby. We're talking about the Japanese horse, Derma. You're going to have to help me on the. I learned an interesting fact, though, Ben. The NTRA had their teleconference yesterday. On there was Katie Hunter, who helps with the Japanese horses in the United States when they run the United States, and mentioned that the owner of this horse, every horse that this owner has, first name is Derma because he's a dermatologist. So fun fact for you there. What do you think of him on the track, though, Ben?
Yeah, on the track, talking about trying to find those possible picks to beat Forte, at least as we sit here on April 27th, I think Derma Sotogake is probably my number one choice. And I mean, John knows this. I always stay away from the shippers, the horses that race internationally and have that. I mean, you're talking about a 3-year-old horse. That's a really tough trip to go over to the UAE Derby. Either whether you're based over there, based somewhere else, and then come over and go through the process of the travel, the quarantine, all of that to get to Kentucky Derby Day. And if you need any indication of how tough that actually is, just look at the results of the horses that have tried to do it. 18 have come out of that UAE Derby. Nobody's finished in the money yet. And you're talking about some really good, some quality horses who have tried that route. And it just hasn't happened yet. But in a field like this, where there aren't, I don't think any, I mean, nobody's unbeatable, but there aren't these really, really strong horses, at least that we've seen so far. I think it kind of opens the window for something like this to happen. And then you look at the UAE Derby, as impressed as I was with Angel of Empire in the Arkansas Derby, that is in that tier. What Derma Sotogake did in that one, basically taking the lead from the beginning, which, I think if a horse can get away with something next Saturday, I think that might be a winning strategy, depending on what that pace looks like, obviously. But just the way he ran that race, he's another one that seems to be just really, really, really on the improve. And another one that I think if everything that goes along with that doesn't take it out of him, I think he's a horse that could very well take another big step next Saturday. Now, just to recap that travel, he's based in Japan. He was based in Japan. On February 25th, he ran in Saudi Arabia. On March 25th, he ran in Dubai in the UAE Derby. And then he flew from Dubai to Chicago on April 5th, quarantined there for a couple of days, vanned from Chicago down to Louisville, I think on April 8th, and has been at Louisville at Churchill Downs ever since. So, I mean, by the time the race comes around, I think it'll be exactly 4 weeks that he will have been in Louisville. But, imagine all the travel that goes along with that and everything that entails. But, he had to work yesterday and looked just absolutely phenomenal, I thought, working in tandem with the other Japanese horse, Continuar, who's in the field right now. So that's a lot of history to overcome, what he's trying to overcome with shipping internationally like that. But I think he might be the horse that finally does it.
What about you, Cam? What are your thoughts on Derma?
Yeah, I was about to say, I think part of this might just also be me poisoned by having so many friends who are into horse racing and, flat out refusing to bet on a Japanese horse to do well in the Kentucky Derby. Very much a wait until it happens and then I'll take it seriously kind of deal, almost like what the 16-1 upset was in the NCAA basketball tournament for the longest time, right? It'll happen eventually. It feels like it's only a matter of time. And frankly, from a numbers standpoint, this year might be the year for it, not only because, as you mentioned, it's a weak class and we feel like Forte is a beatable favorite, but just getting, multiple Japanese horses in the field, because in addition to Derma, Ben was just talking about Continuar, who is actually the Japanese qualifier in the Derby field via the Japanese road to the Kentucky Derby. Mandarin Hero, who we mentioned earlier, ran super impressively in the Santa Anita Derby, is outside of the field right now, but a couple more defections, a couple late scratches. We could find ourselves with three Japanese horses, in a 20-horse field. So I think that'll be pretty interesting. I remember riding on Crown Pride last year, who was an upset win in the UAE Derby, if I remember correctly. I think he was like 16-1. He got caught up in that absolutely blistering pace set by Summers tomorrow at the start of the race. Never really factored into it. So in addition to all the travel, all the frequent flyer miles that Ben just described, everything that goes into getting a horse settled when they're traveling from international waters on Derby Day, just also how is that horse going to handle himself in front of what's obviously going to be the biggest crowd he's ever raced in front of, not to mention just racing against horses with maybe different styles than they've seen overseas, if they're going to end up chasing the pace, if that horse can be reined in well enough. But I think from a pure number standpoint, it is only a matter of time before a Japanese horse, A, places in the money at a Derby, and B, actually comes away with the win. And this year, just on a pure numerical standpoint, and also from a classic field standpoint, feels like if you're going to take a shot, at this happening, you could pick much worse years than this year's for a Japanese horse to show up and perform on Derby Day.
Yeah, and you have to remember that I think it was 2 years ago, two Japanese horses won Breeders' Cup races out at Del Mar in 2021. I mean, it seems like they continue to get better and better. What are your thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, I was gonna mention that about it's actually Continuar's trainer had two horses win in the 2021 Breeders' Cup. Then you had the Dubai World Cup this year, same day as the UAE Derby. Japanese horse wins there. If there are no buyer speed figures for these overseas races, but if there were, just kind of looking at the data, it looks like Dermot Sotogake would be in his own category at the top of that list. If they had that information to put out. So yeah, I just think, and then the other one is Mandarin Hero in the Santa Anita Derby. I think the way he was able to come over and run in that race, the way he did, and almost win it. I mean, if that's a 1.25 mile race, he maybe wins that. And he would be one of my long shots, assuming he is a long shot, if he were to make the Derby field, although he's on the outside looking in now. But I think by all indications, by all accounts over there, Dermot Sotogake is a tier above Mandarin Hero. Mandarin Hero comes over, almost knocks off what on paper is probably the second or third choice in this Derby field. I think that really flatters Dermot Sotogake and also kind of gives you a little confidence that he could do the same thing on another level.
Okay, let's talk about that horse that you mentioned is going to be the second or third, probably one of the second or third favorite in the field, and that's the Santa Anita Derby winner, Practical Move, trained by Tim Yachtine. And this is not a horse that Bob Baffert trained and then gave over to Tim Yachtine because Bob is still banned by Churchill Downs. His banishment will end after the race on May the 6th. But Practical Move has been very impressive so far. Tim Yachtine's done a great job with him. That was a terrific race. As we mentioned, in the Santa Anita Derby, and Tim Yachtine in a totally different position than he was last year, as we mentioned, where Bob Baffert had to ship. Tim's a former Bob Baffert assistant. Bob shifted some of his horses to Tim right before the Derby. When we talked to Tim on the backstretch last year, he was a little, I don't know what little timid about saying a whole lot, considering he didn't train those horses the whole time. He was on an NTRA teleconference this week. I asked him about being in the position with Practical Move, a horse that he has trained all along, being one of the big favorites for the Derby. But I think Tim wanted to make sure he didn't say anything bad about Reincarnate, who is a horse that Baffert trained and then moved over to Tim. But he likes both of his horses, and he obviously likes what Practical Move has been doing. But what do you think about Practical Move, Cam?
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned how last year maybe Tim Yachtine was a bit passive, a bit tentative to say things too revealing in the media conferences that he had leading up to the Derby. I think part of that was probably just because all the questions that were asked to him were about Bob Baffert. And, frankly, rightfully so, because those were two horses that had lived in Bafford's barn. They were Bob Bafford horses that Tim Yakteen, more or less was just kind of the trainer in name only of leading into the Derby. And obviously both of them kind of disappointed when it came to Derby Day. I mean, funny enough, Practical Move wasn't actually bred by Tim Yakteen either. He was bred by Chad Brown before moving into the barn of Tim Yakteen. But as you mentioned, was very impressive in holding off Mandarin Hero in that Santa Anita Derby. He went up at 8-5 odds, so showed the ability to come good as a big race day favorite. He's finished in the money in all 7 of his career starts, so has a good track record, at least when it comes to performing when expected to do well. Is 2 for 2 so far this year, because in addition to that Santa Anita Derby win, also won the San Felipe, also at Santa Anita earlier this year. And so, very interesting horse, definitely someone who's going to be in a good value range given his past performances and given the money that will likely go in on Forte as the morning line favorite. Jockey Ramon Vasquez has been at the Derby before, didn't do too well, was 13th back in 2015 with Mr. Z, sired by Practical Joke, who has a decent track record, was 5th back in that 2017 Derby, 2nd in the 2017 Bluegrass Stakes. So he's got good genes about him, but I'll be fascinated to see how Tim Yakteen moves through the Derby week preparation this year, now that A, he's been through it before as the trainer of record, and B, now that he's going through it with a horse that feels way more fundamentally his horse than was the case last year.
Okay, the last of the favorites that I want to talk about is the Louisiana Derby winner Kingsbarns, another Todd Pletcher horse. Traditionally, the Louisiana Derby winners have not been real prominent in winning the Kentucky Derby. Ben, what do you think about Kingsbarns?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I like Kingsbarns yet, but he's certainly interesting, and I think, for those who maybe just go back and watch the last race before the Derby, they'll go back and watch that Louisiana Derby and say, oh, this is the speed horse. This is the horse that's going to set the pace on Kentucky Derby Day. And I don't think that's the case from watching. And Kingsbarns only has 3 races, which is its own separate conversation. But in watching all 3 of his races, to me, this is a horse who breaks well, gets going well early, and runs his race. And his first 2 races, he was not on the lead. He got out there, he got in a good position, and then he turned it on when it was time to turn it on. Louisiana Derby, the fractions were, he ran the half mile in 49-3. He was 114-3 after that. I mean, it was one of those where he got out and ran his race, and he's looking around and like, is anybody else going to run this race? I'll take the lead if you're not. So I think that's how he got out on the front end in that one. But so there wasn't, only 3 races bothers me. Obviously didn't start at 2. That bothers me from a betting perspective. But if you're looking at maybe the most upside in this field, he's got to be in that conversation just because of what he's done so far with so little seasoning. And you go back and look at his very first race. He coming into the stretch, he comes around that turn and he got completely boxed in. Like he looked like he was ready to make his move and just got completely boxed in. And a lot of times you see a horse do that in their very first race and that's it. They're giving up or they're doing something crazy. This horse stuck with it. He found a seam. A seam basically opened up on the inside after that happened and he just runs away. His second race, he just bided his time. And just absolutely ran away. It looked like it was a jog. It was a walkover in that second race almost. And then obviously a very impressive Louisiana Derby. But I mean, all the history, Justify did win a few years ago, but since Justify won, 8 horses that didn't race at 2 have tried to run in the Derby, and none have finished better than 10th. And that list includes Taiba last year, Charge It, Rock Your World, some really good horses in that group. And obviously before Justify, you go back to the Apollo Curse, and then with the only 3 races to his name, that's another one that has had a drought of winners and really a drought of horses to even finish in the money. So a lot of strikes against him, but he's really, really interesting, and he's a horse that I think people should take a much longer look at between now and next Saturday.
What about you, Cam? What do you think of Kingsbarns?
Yeah, I was going to echo many of the things that Ben just said there. The three races, obviously all of them being wins, but just being such a lightly raced horse kind of scares me and almost automatically puts me off just because of the history that such lightly raced horses have, usually in the Kentucky Derby. But also just a kind of a cool full circle moment that could occur should Kings Barnes find success in the Derby, with his sire being Uncle Mo. Obviously was going to be the early favorite for that 2011 Kentucky Derby before it ended up being scratched. And good progeny there as well with Uncle Mo when you look at 2013 Nyquist, 2019 even Mo Donegal, who ended up coming good in the Belmont Stakes last year. So there's things to like about Kings Barnes. There's good elements. It almost feels like a horse to me, where the longer I look at Kings Barnes, the more as the days clock down toward the Derby, the more I could see myself getting talked into it. But man, it is so difficult to go with a horse that's only raced 3 times, with its only win of consequence being that Louisiana Derby.
Okay, I want to hit on a couple of things before we wrap it up here. First of all, do either one of you have some long shots that you think will be a good price, or is it too early to tell at this point? For the Derby, I really like Verifying and finished second in the Bluegrass. Another Brad Cox horse. What about you guys? Is there one or two horses that you want to take a closer look at next week?
I don't think I necessarily am going to be financially invested in this horse, but I think Lord Miles is going to be someone, especially after what happened to Wild on Ice. I think Lord Miles will be kind of maybe the sentimental choice for a lot of people once they learn about his backstory. Was the winner of the Grade 2 Wood Memorial at Aqueduct at staggering, frankly, 59-1 odds. It was a dramatic 3-horse battle to the wire in that race. Lord Miles had to survive a post-race inquiry to stand up as the winner by a nose. He had won just one of his 4 prior races, all of which occurred in Florida, prior to getting shipped up to New York and winning that Wood Memorial. So was certainly a shock when he basically made the Derby as a result of winning that race and gathering all of those qualifying points. I think Hit Show, the favorite in that race, who ended up being narrowly beaten by Lord Miles, will have some value added to him just because he didn't come good in the Wood Memorial. So I think maybe just I'm not going to put any money on Lord Miles. I want to be very clear about that. But I think he's an interesting story, especially lower down the odds board. And I think Hit Show is probably going to, suffer an odds dip just because of not winning the Wood Memorial. And I think there's things to like about that horse as well. But, long shot wise, it's really interesting when you look at this field, just because nobody at the bottom of the leaderboard really gets me super excited. Granted, it's not like anyone was talking about Rich Strike being an exciting proposition. I mean, this time last year, he wasn't in the Kentucky Derby field. So maybe this is all for naught. But you look at a horse like Disarm, Steve Asmussen, again, trying to win a Derby, same ownership group that owned the favorite Epicenter last year, before Epicenter was beaten, obviously, by Rich Strike. But, not too much else, towards the bottom of the odds board, or at least the bottom of the qualifying points board, that gets me too excited. But maybe those things will change once the post position draw is conducted on Monday and we see where everyone's going to start.
What about you, Ben? Any of the long shots? You're always looking for a long shot.
Yeah.
Any of you excite you, or you want to take a closer look at next week?
Well, as you know, I'm trying to pare down my list of long shots I like this time of year, and this year, to Cam's point earlier, I think it's harder to find ones that you really think have a shot to make it in the money this year. I think those 6 horses that we talked about are all in their own kind of tier. Kings Barnes maybe a little below the other 5, so I'll be sticking mainly with some of those, but. Mage is one. I ran through all the negatives about only 3 career races, but if we're talking about just getting in the money, spicing up an exotic bet, I really like Mage. I go back and watch that Florida Derby. I like the way he's improved. I think he's on the uptick. Again, with such a lightly raced horse, 20 horses around him, you never know how they're going to react. But if he can run his race, I think he could be there at the end. And then Skinner, who tragic, obviously, the way he got into the race today. But Skinner is a horse that I've been looking at for a long time that I think can also be running at the end, coming from behind and maybe picking up some pieces to get in the money. And then if he's 3 defections away, but Mandarin Hero along the same lines as Skinner, if he makes the race, he'll definitely be in my exotics just because I think he could be there at the end too.
Okay, we had a couple of questions from readers' questions. Both really had to do with the Buyer's speed figures. One question was, what Derby winner had the lowest buyer speed figure? We believe that was California Chrome, who I think did not hit triple digits. I believe, he had 97. on when he won it in 2014. The other question is about comparing Beyer speed figures to the Thorograph, which you mentioned earlier, Ben. My understanding is this Beyer speed figures go more off times and are based on the times of the races that day at that particular track, where Thorograph is more into the trends of the horses, how the horse is doing, and projecting forward. You're more you know more about that than I do. Is that your understanding, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could talk for a couple hours about trying to
have a whole
break
show
down.
on
It's,
this,
it's
yeah.
hard to boil that down into. But yeah, Thorograph would be more. I don't know if predictive is the right word, but more, yeah, trying to extrapolate forward and using past and current results to try to see what's going to happen next. And interestingly enough, Angel of Empire, Tapit Trice are a couple who look very good. Verifying too, who you mentioned, I think would fall in that category. While Forte and Practical Move, who might be the two favorites, maybe not necessarily heading in a negative direction, but kind of flattening out there. So something else as you're trying to sort out the favorites that might be worth looking at.
Okay, before we go, I wanted to, we'll start with you, Cam. Make sure and give our viewers your Twitter account, how they can find you on Twitter, and anything else, anything on the Kentucky Derby week or leading up to the Derby week that you want to make sure that they're looking out for.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at CDRUMMOND97. That's at CDrummond97. And obviously us and everyone else at the great team at Kentucky.com, at Kentucky.com/sports will be covering things wall to wall, really, from this week through next week, all the way until Derby Day on May 6th. We'll have what seems like a billion stories come out, everything from analyzing where the horses are in the post position draw, who that tends to favor, to some in-depth feature stories on trainers, owners, jockeys, the horses themselves. I'm not sure if we'll give good quotes this year, but we can always try to get some good stuff out of them. And then just the race in general. How have favorites done historically in the Derby? It's been a few years since Justified came good and won the Kentucky Derby as a favorite. Obviously, it's kind of going to be framed as Forte versus the field this year, so I think we'll find some interesting historical stuff there. And also just reminding people that we're still, a week plus out from the Derby, so a lot of things could change. For example, the Ben Colbrook horse Raise Cane doesn't even have a jockey assigned yet for the Derby. They're still trying to figure that out. So if you want the latest and greatest in all the Derby news, be sure to visit us at Kentucky.com/sports, and we'll keep you up to date of all the news from now until post position time, which I gotta say also is insanely late. They're gonna shoehorn the Derby into being like an 8 o'clock post time at some point in my lifetime, and I am going to hate it when I'm trying to write on deadline.
So it's going to be in prime time before we know it. What about you, Ben? Remind the viewers where they can find you on Twitter and what you have coming up.
Yeah, it's just Ed Ben Roberts HL on Twitter, and we'll have the annual handicapping column trying to run down all 20 plus horses because we usually do the also innards too. That'll drop somewhere around mid next week. I always hit up our friends in the horse racing media around the state and around the country for their win play show picks and usually some explainers on why they arrived at the picks that they did. That's always popular when people are trying to figure out their own bets. And then we'll have a long shots column, usually comes at the end of next week, and then just a lot of stuff. Yeah, trying to get people who haven't been following along for the last few months, going back to the 2-year-old season, just kind of get them up to date on who these horses are, just kind of the nitty gritty and the just kind of the facts and figures around all of them. So yeah, that'll all be dropping next week. And then obviously one of my favorite, as far as the print edition, one of my favorite sections every year is that special section, which will be on, I think, Friday of next week, that has everybody's, great stories and all the stuff that's kind of in there throughout the week. A lot of that is in that Friday section. So if you're looking for something to take home and look through on Derby Saturday, that's certainly something good to have by the recliner to take with you to your Derby party or the track.
Yeah,
I guess well, John, I was about to say, you've covered enough of these. What are you looking forward to in this race? I want to say on one long ride to Churchill last year, I think you told me your first Derby was, I want to say, Gato del Sol in 82. Yeah, so you've covered enough of these. You've got a special package coming out soon about Secretariat in the 50th anniversary, of the Triple Crown win. But what strikes you about this Derby?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you can follow me on Twitter at John Clay IV. Yeah, I did a package of stories about the 50th anniversary of Secretariat. Those are online now. They'll be in the print edition of the Herald-Leader on Sunday. For look for that. I'm just looking forward to Derby Week. Derby Week is always a lot of fun leading up to the Derby, starting with the draw early in the week, and we'll have plenty of coverage of all of that. And you never know what's going to happen Derby Week or in the Derby, just like Rich Strike proved to us again last year. So I want to thank everybody for watching us today. I want to thank everybody who supports our work at the Lexington Herald-Leader and Kentucky.com. And as I mentioned, we will have plenty of coverage leading up to, during, and after the race next week. So be sure and look for that. Thank you to Ben. Thank you to Cam. Thank you to everybody who has been watching. And I hope everybody has a great Kentucky Derby.